There's a particular kind of collapse that can happen after a narcissist loses someone who genuinely loved them, and it often looks completely different from what people expect. From the outside, they may appear fine. They may move on quickly, become involved with someone else, post happier pictures, act completely unaffected, or even behave as though losing you was their decision all along. But appearances can be deeply misleading. The absence of visible grief doesn't necessarily mean the loss had no impact. Sometimes the most significant psychological consequences are happening underneath the performance where nobody else can easily see them. Today, we're going to examine what can happen when a narcissist loses a person who offered genuine love, emotional depth, patience, and connection without remaining permanently available for mistreatment. Not because every narcissist experiences the same emotional process, and not because there is some guaranteed dramatic breakdown waiting to happen, but because losing a significant source of attention, validation, familiarity, and emotional regulation can expose vulnerabilities that were previously being managed through the relationship itself. Let's start with the first painful reality. Losing genuine love doesn't necessarily make a narcissist immediately realize what they lost. This is one of the most important things to understand because waiting for immediate recognition can keep you emotionally connected long after the relationship has ended. You may expect them to suddenly understand everything. You imagine the moment when they finally sit alone and realize, I destroyed the one person who truly loved me. But human psychology rarely works that neatly. Sometimes the first response is denial. They may convince themselves that you were the problem. They may rewrite the relationship. They may focus on your mistakes. They may tell themselves that they never really needed you. They may quickly seek another source of attention. And they may genuinely appear convinced by their own version of events. This doesn't necessarily mean they're experiencing nothing. It means that what they're experiencing may be filtered through defenses that protect their self-image. And that's where the collapse begins to make sense. Because the person they lost wasn't simply providing companionship. They may have been providing emotional stability, reassurance, admiration, forgiveness, familiarity, and a sense of being deeply understood. When that disappears, the absence can become noticeable slowly. At first, there may be relief. No arguments, no accountability conversations, no one asking difficult questions, no one challenging contradictions, no one expecting them to explain themselves. They may interpret this relief as proof that leaving was the right decision. But relief isn't always resolution. Sometimes relief is simply the temporary absence of pressure. And once the distraction fades, the deeper absence becomes harder to ignore. This is where the second stage often begins: comparison. The new person may be attractive, they may be exciting, they may be impressed by him, they may give him attention. Everything can appear perfect. But eventually, relationships become ordinary. The excitement settles, the initial admiration becomes familiar, and the differences begin appearing. The new person may not understand him in the same way. She may not tolerate the same behaviors. She may establish boundaries earlier. She may not provide the same emotional reassurance. She may not have the same history with him. And suddenly, the person he lost becomes a reference point. Not necessarily because he consciously sits around romanticizing the past, but because the contrast becomes unavoidable. He remembers how easily you understood certain moods. He remembers how much you tolerated. He remembers how quickly you noticed when something was wrong. He remembers conversations he didn't appreciate at the time. He remembers the feeling of having someone emotionally invested in his life. And this is where the loss can become painful, because genuine love often becomes most visible after it is no longer available. While someone is present, their emotional labor can become invisible. Their patience becomes expected. Their support becomes normal. Their forgiveness becomes assumed. Their attention becomes part of the environment. But remove it, and suddenly the environment feels different. The person who used to answer isn't answering. The person who used to care isn't checking. The person who used to explain isn't explaining anymore. The person who used to keep the relationship emotionally alive has stopped doing the work. And that absence can create a strange kind of psychological silence. This is where many people make a mistake. They assume that if the narcissist reaches out, it automatically means love has returned. But reaching out and changing are two different things. Missing access to someone isn't necessarily the same as understanding how you hurt them. Wanting someone back isn't necessarily the same as becoming capable of treating them differently, and feeling lonely isn't necessarily the same as becoming ready for healthy intimacy. This distinction matters enormously, because when someone loses a person who provided genuine emotional connection, they may attempt to restore the old arrangement without addressing what destroyed it. They may send a nostalgic message. They may mention an old memory. They may suddenly become affectionate. They may say they miss you. They may tell you nobody understands them like you did. And all of those statements can feel incredibly powerful when you're still emotionally attached. But before interpreting them as evidence of transformation, look for something deeper. Accountability, consistency, behavior, a genuine acknowledgement of what happened, and sustained change that exists even when they aren't afraid of losing you. Without those things, a return may simply be an attempt to restore familiarity. And this brings us to one of the most painful aspects of the collapse. The narcissist may eventually realize that the person they lost isn't easily replaceable, not because you were perfect, not because nobody else will ever love them, but because genuine connection isn't created simply by finding another person. It requires emotional capacity. It requires vulnerability. It requires reciprocity. It requires the ability to tolerate another person's needs without experiencing those needs as an attack. And if those capacities remain underdeveloped, changing partners doesn't automatically change the underlying pattern. The same person can enter a new relationship with a completely different partner and eventually recreate many of the same dynamics. Different face, same pattern, different beginning, similar ending, and that's when comparison becomes painful, because the problem was never simply that the previous partner wasn't good enough. The problem may have been the relational pattern itself. And when the same pattern keeps repeating, the person eventually has to confront something they may have spent years avoiding. The common denominator is me. That realization can be deeply threatening, because blaming the previous partner is psychologically easier than examining yourself. If every failed relationship happened because the other person was crazy, too emotional, too needy, too demanding, too controlling, or impossible to please, then nothing inside you needs to change. But eventually, the evidence can become difficult to ignore. Different relationships, different people, different circumstances, same conflicts, same accusations, same withdrawal, same betrayal, same cycle. At some point, the pattern becomes visible, and that is where the collapse can become much more internal. The external world may still look fine. They may still be working, dating, posting, going out, laughing, appearing successful. But internally, there may be increasing tension between the person they believe themselves to be and the pattern their life keeps demonstrating. That tension can be uncomfortable, and some people respond to discomfort by reflecting. Others respond by escaping. More distraction, more attention, more relationships, more achievement, more validation, more attempts to prove that everything is fine. But the more external noise increases, the harder it can become to hear the underlying question: why do I keep losing people who genuinely cared about me? And perhaps the most painful part is that you may never witness the answer. You may never see the private moment of realization. You may never receive the apology. You may never hear them admit that they lost something valuable. You may never know whether they compared future relationships to what they had with you, and that's something you have to make peace with, because your healing cannot depend on witnessing their collapse. Their consequences are not your closure. Their regret is not your validation. Their loneliness is not proof that you were right. Your value existed before they recognized it, and it will continue to exist whether they ever recognize it at all. That's the deeper meaning behind the painful collapse. It isn't about watching someone suffer because they lost you. It's about understanding that sometimes people only recognize the value of something after their own behavior has made access to it impossible. And when genuine love is gone, the person who received it may eventually feel the weight of its absence. But by then, you may already be somewhere completely different, not waiting, not watching, not hoping, just living. And that is where the story becomes less about what happens to the narcissist after losing you and much more about what happens to you after finally realizing that losing access to you was not the end of your life. It was the beginning of getting it back. And this is where the collapse becomes more complicated, because losing genuine love doesn't always create an immediate emotional breakdown. Sometimes it creates a long period of avoidance first. The person may stay busy, surround themselves with people, begin another relationship, become unusually active socially, or suddenly present an image of complete freedom. From the outside, it can look like they have moved on effortlessly, but moving forward and processing a loss are not the same thing. Someone can replace the relationship without replacing what the relationship provided. They can find another person without finding the same emotional depth. They can receive attention without receiving genuine understanding. They can experience attraction without experiencing trust. And eventually, those differences become difficult to ignore. This is where the fantasy of replacement begins meeting reality. In the beginning, a new relationship can provide novelty. Everything feels fresh. There are new conversations, new attention, new possibilities, and none of the accumulated history that made the previous relationship difficult. There are no old arguments yet, no established patterns, no painful memories attached to ordinary interactions. The new person may see only the version being presented to her. That can feel incredibly refreshing. But novelty eventually becomes normal. And when normal arrives, personality patterns arrive with it. The same emotional triggers, the same need for validation, the same difficulty tolerating criticism, the same defensiveness, the same expectations, the same attempts to control the emotional environment. And if nothing internal has changed, the new relationship eventually begins carrying the same structural problems as the old one. This is why changing partners is not necessarily the same as changing behavior. A different relationship can create a different environment, but it cannot automatically create a different person. And this is where memories of genuine love can become especially painful, because you may have offered something that wasn't immediately obvious while you were together. You may have given patience during moments when patience wasn't easy. You may have listened when he was difficult to understand. You may have seen parts of him that other people never noticed. You may have believed in his potential. You may have remained emotionally present during periods when the relationship gave you very little in return. At the time, those things may have felt ordinary, but once they're gone, their absence can become very obvious. There is a strange psychological phenomenon that happens when someone becomes accustomed to a person's emotional labor. They stop noticing the labor. The person who always checks in doesn't seem especially remarkable because the checking in has become expected. The person who remembers important details doesn't seem extraordinary because those details are simply remembered. The person who keeps forgiving doesn't seem endlessly generous because forgiveness has become part of the relationship's rhythm. But remove that person, and suddenly someone has to experience life without all those invisible acts of care. That is when the difference becomes visible. And this is where regret can begin. But regret itself can have different forms. There is regret over losing access. There is regret over losing comfort. There is regret over losing attention. There is regret over losing status. And then there is regret over realizing that your own choices destroyed something genuinely valuable. The last one requires the most self-awareness, because it forces a person to look inward. It requires saying, I didn't simply lose this. I participated in losing it. That's a much more painful realization. And for someone whose defenses depend heavily on protecting their self-image, that realization can be difficult to tolerate. So instead of accepting responsibility, they may rewrite the story. Maybe you were never that special. Maybe the relationship was always bad. Maybe you were too emotional. Maybe they were already unhappy. Maybe they were better off without you. Maybe the new relationship is proof that you were the problem. These explanations can temporarily protect the ego, but they don't necessarily eliminate the underlying loss, because somewhere beneath the story remains the experience itself. They remember what they had. They remember how you made them feel. They remember the attention. They remember the familiarity. They remember being understood. And even if they never consciously admit it, the comparison can remain. This is why you should never measure your worth by whether someone publicly acknowledges losing you. People can miss someone and never admit it. People can regret something and still defend themselves. People can feel lonely and still refuse accountability. Human beings are complicated, and especially when someone's self-image is heavily defended, internal conflict doesn't always produce honest confession. Sometimes it produces more denial. Sometimes it produces anger. Sometimes it produces blame. Sometimes it produces another relationship, and sometimes it produces a sudden desire to reconnect. This is why the return can happen months later, not necessarily because the person suddenly developed healthy love. Sometimes the emotional distance has simply allowed the negative feelings associated with the breakup to fade, while the positive memories become stronger. The brain can romanticize what is gone. The difficult moments become less vivid. The good moments become more emotionally accessible. And suddenly the relationship feels better in memory than it actually felt in reality. This can create a dangerous situation for you, because if you're still healing, you may also be romanticizing the past. You may both be remembering the same relationship differently. You may remember the tenderness. They may remember the emotional availability. You may remember the betrayal. They may remember the comfort. You may remember why you left. They may remember why they want you back. And if you reconnect without addressing the actual pattern, both people can temporarily feel relief while walking directly back into the same structure that caused the original collapse. This is why nostalgia should never be confused with transformation. Nostalgia remembers. Transformation changes. If someone truly changed, you won't need to imagine it. You'll see it. You'll see accountability without being forced. You'll see consistency without constant reminders. You'll see respect during conflict. You'll see boundaries being accepted. You'll see mistakes being acknowledged. You'll see behavior remaining different even when there is no immediate reward. That is evidence. Everything else is possibility, and you cannot build your future on possibility alone. This is also why the collapse after losing genuine love can sometimes be delayed. The person may not feel the full weight of the loss until after several distractions stop working. The new relationship becomes ordinary. The attention becomes less exciting. The social activity becomes repetitive. The validation doesn't feel as satisfying. The old memories return. The comparison becomes stronger. And then there is a quiet moment when there is nothing left to distract from the absence. That's when the emotional reality can become much harder to avoid. They may remember someone who genuinely cared, someone who knew their flaws and still stayed, someone who saw behind the image, someone who wasn't impressed merely by status or charm, someone whose love wasn't based entirely on what they could receive. And suddenly they understand something painful. The person they treated as replaceable wasn't actually replaceable in the way they assumed, not because nobody else can love them, but because every individual relationship has a unique emotional history. You cannot recreate a specific bond by finding another person with similar qualities. You cannot reproduce years of shared memories. You cannot recreate the exact feeling of being known by someone who watched you through different seasons of your life. And if that relationship was destroyed through repeated betrayal or mistreatment, no amount of nostalgia can reverse the consequences. This is where the phrase, "you don't know what you have until it's gone," becomes psychologically significant. But there's an important correction. You should never wait around hoping someone reaches this realization. Because if you make their regret the reward for leaving, you remain emotionally tied to their reaction. You leave because the relationship is no longer healthy for you. You leave because your boundaries matter. You leave because repeated behavior has given you enough information. You leave because your future deserves more than waiting for someone to become capable of what you already needed. Their eventual realization is separate, and if it never comes, your decision remains valid. This is one of the hardest lessons after narcissistic relationships because part of you may desperately want the other person to understand. You want them to know you weren't disposable. You want them to understand how deeply they hurt you. You want them to recognize that you gave them something genuine. You want them to regret every moment they took that love for granted. Those feelings are human. But eventually, you have to release the need for them to carry the same interpretation of the story that you do. You know what you gave. You know what you tolerated. You know how many times you tried. You know how much you hoped. You know why you finally stopped. That knowledge can be enough. And when it becomes enough, something shifts. You stop checking whether they're suffering. And this is where the painful collapse reaches its deepest point, because eventually the loss stops being about the person who left and starts becoming about the version of life that can no longer be recovered. A narcissist may replace a partner, they may find someone new, they may create another relationship that looks exciting from the outside, they may even convince themselves that the previous relationship was never important. But what cannot simply be replaced is history.